Your home has a dirty secret buried inside its walls. While millions of modern houses surrendered to temperatures barely scraping -10, men living in 90-square-foot log boxes buried into frozen hillsides in the 1820s, Rocky Mountains survived weeks at -30 with nothing but a single fireplace and a pile of furs. No smart thermostat, no spray foam, no HVAC system humming in the basement. They didn't just survive, they were comfortable. And the reason your house can't do the same thing isn't a mystery. It's a choice someone made for you, long before you ever signed a mortgage. A choice that was never about keeping you warm. It was about keeping costs low and production fast. Picture the winter of 1807. John Coulter is somewhere inside what we now call Yellowstone National Park, moving alone through a landscape so cold and so remote that no non-native human being had ever seen it before. He is carrying a 30-pound pack, a rifle, a knife, and a tomahawk. That is everything. Temperatures in that region in January routinely drop to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind comes sideways off the Continental Divide, and it does not stop. And Coulter is walking through it, more than 500 miles of it, alone, no radio, no emergency shelter, no backup. He crossed that landscape on snowshoes, slept under what the land provided, and arrived back at Fort Raymond in the spring of 1808, alive, healthy, and ready to go again. Here's what should shake you. John Coulter survived conditions that a modern American home, fully equipped with central heating, would fail to survive without grid power. So what did he know that the house you live in was never designed to use? Before we get into the answer, I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever been in a situation where your heat went out during a serious cold snap? Maybe a burst pipe, maybe a power outage, maybe you just stood next to a window on a January night and felt the cold radiating off the glass, even with the thermostat turned up. Drop that story in the comments below, because what you're about to discover will change how you see every wall in your house, and why the home you were told was well insulated is actually one of the most thermally fragile structures ever built at scale. Let's start with the modern failure, because it is a failure. Walk into a typical American house built anytime from the 1950s through the 1990s and look at the exterior wall. Behind the drywall, behind the vapor barrier, tucked between studs set 16 inches apart, you will find 3.5 inches of fiberglass batt insulation. Pink or yellow, fluffy, compressible. The industry calls this R13. That R value is measured in a laboratory at a controlled temperature in perfectly dry conditions with the fiberglass precisely fitted and undisturbed. Here's what happens in the real world. Wood studs make up roughly 27% of the wall's surface area, and wood studs provide only about R 3.5 per 3.5 inches. That means more than a quarter of your exterior wall is a thermal bridge, a direct conduction path for cold to walk straight through the structure. Then add moisture. A 1.5% increase in moisture content in fiberglass insulation can reduce its R value by up to 50%. And once fiberglass batts get wet, they permanently lose 20 to 40% of their performance even after they dry out. An Oak Ridge National Laboratory study found that loose-fill fiberglass lost between 35 and 50% of its thermal resistance at the exact temperature differentials that occur during polar vortex events. The conditions when you need it most are precisely the conditions when it fails the hardest. Then compare this to what John Coulter slept inside when he finally reached a winter camp. A log cabin with walls of softwood, logs 1 to 2 feet in diameter, gaps chinked with moss, clay, animal hair, and mud. Low ceilings, south-facing entrance, maybe one small window, sometimes none. No vapor barrier, no manufactured components, just mass. And the thing is, that wall worked, not despite being simple, because of it. Here's where it gets interesting and a little uncomfortable. The construction industry does not want you thinking about this comparison for very long, because the moment you understand thermal mass, you start asking questions about why your house was built the way it was. And the answers are not flattering. The villain in this story is not one company or one corrupt engineer. It's an industrial decision made for speed and profit that quietly stripped the thermal resilience out of American housing and then left you holding the heating bill. The system didn't fail. It did exactly what it was designed to do: produce homes cheaply and quickly. Your heating costs are not your fault. Your cold bedroom in January is not your fault. You were handed a product that was never optimized for your comfort. It was optimized for the developer's timeline. Now let's go layer by layer into what actually worked and why. The first layer is thermal mass. This is the physics that the 1820s mountain man understood without ever taking a physics class, and that modern stick frame construction almost entirely eliminated. Thermal mass is the ability of a dense material to absorb heat, store it, and release it slowly over time. Think of it like a battery. A fiberglass wall cavity charges instantly and discharges instantly. When the heat source stops, the temperature drops within minutes. A solid log wall or an earthen wall is a slow battery. It takes hours to charge, and it releases that stored heat for hours after the fire dies. Softwood logs store roughly 900 kilojoules of heat energy per cubic meter per degree of temperature change. Fiberglass insulation stores about 30 kilojoules. That's a 30-to-1 advantage in stored thermal energy per unit of volume. When a mountain man banked his fire for the night in a solid log cabin, the walls themselves kept radiating warmth until morning. When your furnace shuts off in a stick frame house, the air cools almost immediately because there is nothing, literally nothing, in the walls with enough thermal capacity to hold the temperature. The National Bureau of Standards, which is now NIST, proved this in a landmark study conducted from 1980 to 1982. Researchers built 6 identical 20 by 20 foot test buildings near Washington, D.C., differing only in wall construction. A solid log building with walls at a nominal R10 was compared directly against an insulated wood frame building at a nominal R12. The log building had a lower rated R value. On paper, it should have lost. Over 14 weeks of winter heating, the two buildings consumed essentially the same energy. Then, during a 3-week spring period, the log building used 46% less heating energy. In summer, it required 24% less cooling energy. The researcher, Doug Birch, concluded that mass wall buildings appeared to save heating energy compared to well-insulated lightweight frame buildings. The Department of Energy now formally acknowledges that logs act as thermal batteries and can increase apparent R value by a factor that static R value measurements simply cannot capture. If you're finding this valuable, now is a good time to hit like, because this is exactly the kind of information that the building industry has very little interest in putting in a billboard. The second layer is what mountain men called site selection and what building scientists now call passive design. Before John Coulter or Hugh Glass or any mountain man put an axe to the first log, they chose where to build. And those choices were not random. They were thermally calculated. Cabins face south, always south, to capture maximum winter solar gain. Dugouts went on the south face of low hills, backed into the earth with the cold north wind breaking against the hillside above them. William Swain, a California miner writing in 1852, described his cabin explicitly. It faces the south and is on the north side of the river. That single sentence contains an entire passive heating strategy. The entrance angled away from prevailing winds. Dense cottonwood groves served as windbreaks. Winter camps moved to lower elevations as autumn deepened because cold air drains downhill, and lower river valleys offered measurably more shelter from the killing winds above. This wasn't instinct. It was accumulated knowledge passed from experienced men to apprentices over decades, and every single principle they used is validated by modern building science. South-facing windows and passive solar gain are now standard recommendations in net zero home design. Wind protection reduces infiltration losses by measurable percentages. The mountain men had no textbooks. They had consequences. The wrong site choice meant you died. The third layer, and this is the one that should make you genuinely angry, is earth sheltering. Because this is the technique that takes everything we've discussed and amplifies it by an order of magnitude. and it was used systematically by Native Americans for centuries, adopted by frontier settlers in the form of dugout cabins, documented by multiple researchers through the 1970s and 1980s, and then left completely off the table when the post-war housing boom decided to stamp identical platform-framed boxes onto every flat piece of land within commuting distance of every American city. Here is the physics. Below the frost line in most temperate regions, the ground holds a steady temperature of approximately 50 to 57 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of what is happening on the surface. At 10 feet deep, annual temperature variation narrows to just 2 or 3 degrees. Data from a Japanese monitoring station at the Mimu Earth Lab confirmed that at 10 meters of depth, ground temperature held at 48 degrees Fahrenheit when surface air had dropped to minus 8.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a 56-degree differential between what the Earth is holding and what the air is doing. When you build into that Earth, you are not fighting the cold with heating equipment. You are borrowing from a thermal reservoir that never fluctuates. Roger Wehage, owner of a Davis Caves earth-sheltered home in Chillicothe, Illinois, stated it plainly. He said, "We could leave this house for a full winter, provide no heat, and the temperature would not drop below about 60 degrees, even if it got down to below zero outside. No furnace. No heat pump. 60 degrees. In a below zero Illinois winter." George Catlin, the painter who documented the Mandan people along the upper Missouri River in the 1830s, wrote that their semi-subterranean earth lodges were perfectly warm, even when the thermometer stood at 40 degrees below zero. These were circular structures 30 to 60 feet in diameter, built with heavy timber frames covered in willows, grass, and several feet of packed earth. Entrance tunnels, 6 to 15 feet long, angled away from prevailing winds, functioning as cold air traps that prevented the brutal outdoor air from reaching the interior. The earliest of these structures, dating to the early 1500s, were built even thicker and heavier than later designs, as a direct architectural response to the Little Ice Age. These were not primitive shelters. They were engineered responses to extreme cold, using the most abundant thermal mass available. The Earth itself. The University of Minnesota Underground Space Center published research in the late 1970s and early 1980s showing that fully burned earth-sheltered buildings in Boston could achieve 50% reductions in winter heating energy compared to conventional above-grade construction. The Department of Energy ran studies in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, documenting 30% energy savings over conventional buildings with peak cooling loads cut by 50%. By 1981, the Minnesota Research Center had sold 160,000 copies of its Earth-Sheltered Housing Design Guide. People wanted this. The knowledge existed. It was not lost. So why did we stop? This is the question that sits at the center of everything. And the answer follows the same three-part pattern almost every time a superior technology gets replaced by an inferior one: speed, cost, and a new tool that made the old way look unnecessary. Balloon framing arrived in Chicago around 1832, credited to builders like George Washington Snow and Augustine Taylor. It required no master carpenters. Any farmer, as one account put it, could build his own buildings without a time-consuming learning curve. Machine-made nails and standardized dimensional lumber made it cheap. Then, in October of 1938, Owens Corning Fiberglass Corporation formed, having accidentally discovered fiberglass in 1932 when researcher Dale Kleist at Corning Glass blew compressed air into molten glass. By the 1950s, pink fiberglass bats had become the residential insulation standard, and then the GI Bill arrived. Between 1945 and 1960, approximately 22 million housing units were started in the United States. Leavitt & Sons broke ground on the first Levittown in 1947. They built 17,447 homes on Long Island. Each one was 750 square feet. Each one sold for $7,990. Each one was built by workers performing one of 26 or 27 discrete tasks before moving to the next house. At peak production, Levitt completed 30 homes per day. William Levitt said it himself. We are not builders. We are manufacturers. Mass production, maximum speed, minimum cost. Thermal resilience was never part of the equation, and the bill for that decision has been coming due ever since. February 2021, Winter Storm Uri hits Texas. Dallas recorded -2 degrees Fahrenheit on February 16th, the coldest temperature in 72 years. More than 4.5 million Texas homes and businesses lost power. The official death toll reached 246 people, with independent analysis estimating as many as 702. Of confirmed deaths, 158 were from hypothermia, people who froze inside homes that were supposed to shelter them. State Farm Insurance received 29,000 frozen pipe claims before February 22nd versus 75 in all of the previous year, a 386-fold increase. Average damage ran $27,000 per incident. Total insured losses approached $18 billion. And the reason those homes failed is exactly what we have been talking about. Stick frame walls, fiberglass insulation, no thermal mass, complete dependency on continuous grid power to maintain any warmth at all. Rocky Mountain Institute modeled this directly. A 1950s-era American home drops below 40 degrees Fahrenheit in just 8 hours without heating. 8 hours. A log cabin with an unlit fireplace holds its temperature for days. An earth-sheltered home, as Roger Wehedge confirmed, holds 60 degrees for the entire winter with no heat source at all. That is not a small difference. That is the difference between a structure and a shelter. Now here is what you can actually do about this. You have options, and they range from something you can act on this week to something you can plan for over the next several years. The first option is the easiest, and it costs almost nothing. Identify the thermal weak points in your existing home and address them strategically. Air sealing around electrical outlets on exterior walls, around window and door frames, along the base of the walls at the floor line. A tube of acoustic sealant and a few hours of work can reduce infiltration losses that account for as much as 30 to 40% of a home's heat loss in older construction. Add thermal mass passively by placing dense materials, stone, tile, water containers, even concrete planters in south-facing rooms where winter sunlight hits them directly. They will absorb solar heat during the day and release it at night. It is not an earth lodge, but it is the same physics working in your favor instead of against you. The second option is for those planning a renovation or addition. When you are opening walls anyway, will add rigid foam board against the exterior sheathing before recladding. This breaks the thermal bridge at the studs. Even 2 inches of rigid foam, roughly R10, applied continuously across the exterior eliminates the stud bypass that makes fiberglass-filled cavities perform so far below their rated values. Pair this with a south-facing window addition in a living space, and you have installed passive solar gain that will provide free heat for the lifetime of the building. The third option is knowing what to look for if you are buying or building. Ask about wall thickness. Ask about thermal mass. Ask whether the design considers passive solar orientation. A home that faces south with its primary glazing that has some form of thermal mass in the floor or walls, that is sheltered from north and northwest winds, that home will hold its temperature during a grid outage in ways a standard platform-framed box simply cannot. You do not need to build an earth lodge. You just need to build with the same awareness that the men who survived the Rockies brought to every site, every log, and every layer of chinking they pressed into those walls with their hands. John Coulter wasn't lucky. He wasn't tougher than you in any essential way. He was the product of a building tradition that understood cold at a level modern construction has never had to reckon with because it has always assumed the grid would stay on. The mountain men were thermal engineers working with logs and moss and earth and the angle of the winter sun. They built for the assumption of failure. For the night the fire would go out. But for the week the storm would not break. And the structures they built held, not because they had better technology, because they had better physics. The knowledge wasn't lost. It was traded away for 30 homes a day. If this kind of buried, forgotten, deliberately overlooked knowledge is what you're here for, subscribe. We are digging through history, building science, and the decisions that shape the world you live in to find the things that actually work, the things that got left behind when profit replaced craft. Tell us in the comments what you want us to investigate next. What product, what system, what piece of modern life do you suspect has a better, older, quieter answer waiting underneath it? We want to know, and we want to find it.